right, everyone. Welcome to a very a deeply interesting conversation, specifically on the topic of magic, specifically circles and Solomonic magic. And I'm honored to be joined by a real panel of experts, including incredibly important scholar and practitioner in the field, Dr. Stephen Skinner. I'm deeply honored to be joined, especially by him. Of course, I'm joined also by other wonderful scholars. But Dr. Skinner, I want to say before we get started, my deep gratitude for the work you've done in this field. It has transformed it, has enabled me to do the kind of work that I do, and I'm deeply honored and grateful to have you here on Esoterica.
That's very kind of you to say. I just feel I've been working at this stuff, well, probably since the early 60s, and it's very much part of my life.
Well, it's enriched my life and enriched many other people's lives, and so I think I speak for many fans of Esoterica in expressing
Thank you.
our gratitude. Um, Well, this is also a co-sponsored event with RINSEP in which we're going to be doing a little bit of what RINSEP does, and that is to say, putting scholars and practitioners, academics and practitioners into conversation, and specifically here on the topic of magic circles, which is, I think, again, when I think most people imagine magic at some level, what jumps to mind almost immediately is, in fact, a magic circle. And so, in order to kick that off, what I'd like to do first is do a very short round of introduction so that we kind of know who we all are, and then I want to kick it over to Andrea, who has just completed a dissertation on magic circles, and to kind of kick off the conversation and to begin to explore this very rich and important topic in the history of magic. So maybe we can just go across the top and then through the left if folks want to just briefly introduce themselves.
My name is Andrea Centore, and I'm here as the co-founder and managing director of the Research Network for the Study of Esoteric Practices, otherwise known as RANSEP. I have a background in translation studies and religious studies with a specialization in esotericism, and my research interest lies in the intersection between Jewish and Islamic esotericism in the Middle Ages.
So I'm next. I'm Bernd-Christian Otto. I'm a scholar of religion. I work at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany, where I'm also co-founder of a Center for Advanced Studies. I'm also a co-founder of RANSEP, and I've studied the history of magic from different angles over the last almost 20 years.
Hi, I'm Emily Selove. I'm an associate professor of medieval Arabic literature at the University of Exeter, and I also convene our Center for Magic and Esotericism and our master's degree in magic and occult science there. My early research actually focused on Arabic literature, often comic banquet literature, but it led me strangely, naturally into the study of magic, and I've spent the last 10 years really focusing on a 13th century Arabic grimoire called the Kitab al-Shamil.
I'm Stephen Skinner, and as I said a bit earlier, I've been involved with magic practically for ever since the early 60s. I later became an academic, but in the early 60s, I was a geography lecturer. Geography is a very physical subject and not really connected to magic. And so I've looked at it from both sides, and I take a basically physical thought that things should be tested and actually done to see if they work, and if not, why not?
Great. And my name is Andrea Franchetto. I am a doctor in history of religions. I've defended my dissertation in 2024 and October 2024, and I'm currently teaching a course on the history of learned magic from late antiquity to the modern time, 20th century, at Stockholm University. And also, like Dr. Skinner, actually, I come from a very physical discipline. Before my my education in history of religions, I was an architect, trained architect, and I also then take a very practical approach to the matter of magic. Indeed, my dissertation has focused on his title, Rituals of Perceptual Presence, Space, Material Culture, and Efficacy in Late Medieval Magic. And indeed, one of the focuses of the thesis was precisely how medieval practitioner and magical experts conceived the space of interaction between their body and the corporeality of spiritual beings, and um, and therefore by doing this work, I of course focus a lot on the magic circle, which is probably the how to say, the paramount spatial device for entering contact with spiritual beings, usually spirits or demons. Solomonic magic has a wide variety of typology of magic circles and models of the circles. But so to start like presenting maybe this spatial device, I could say that yeah, magic circle are never simple circumferences traced on the ground where the practitioner usually stand, but not necessarily. Practitioner also could stand outside the circle and the spirit inside the circle. Maybe we can discuss more thoroughly this later. But magic circle are assemblages of concentric circumferences, directional axes, words of power, also different kind of text, also informative text in the diagrams of magic circles appear, um, gestures, right? So usually practitioners draw magic circle with their knives or swords, and uh, and also magic circles are ritual events, what I call them, because they are temporary, so they usually are constructed and erased after, at least in medieval magic, after the summoning of demons and the end of the ritual. But also they are temporal in the sense that they are made of different parts, so they're constructed of different elements that should be drawn and traced at different time of the ritual, and they're part usually of the preparatory phases of the ritual procedures. I should also say that probably magic circle are not only found in Solomonic magic. Right, Solomonic magic is a category that describes texts that circulated under the authority of Solomon, but indeed the Solomonic category doesn't tell so much about the techniques involved, which could be very different. So, for example, the Ars Notoria, which is a paramount Solomonic text, doesn't deal with magic circle, as instead the Key of Solomon or the Liber Iuratus are some parts of the Liber Iuratus are so focused on the magic circle. And when it comes to magic circle, therefore, like we can see that there is a tendency that, at least in medieval learned magic, that it's used to interact with beings that are in the lower ranking system, so spirits usually and demonic entities. To a lesser extent with angels. We have other special devices like altars, portable altars, or incubation rituals. So angels should appear in dreams and not perceptually out there in the physical environment. And therefore, here comes the predominant presence of circle when practitioner aim to establish a relationship, a corporeal relationship, when the spirit is out there, is in the veridical space of the operator. So the practitioner is awake, and somehow they have to interact in that space with practitioners. Maybe I could stop here, and then yeah, we can continue.
Maybe I can ask a question here. So a question for our three guests, Emily, Stephen, and Andrea. So I know that the circle is used as a protective device during magical practices. So it's one of its purposes is to protect the magician during the magical operation. So I have a very simple and naive question: why it should be a circle and not another shape?
Well, because the circle is probably the most perfect geometric shape. It's also practical if you're standing in the middle of something, then the circle's boundary are the same distance from you. But indeed, some of the early circles were inscribed, particularly ones from Greek texts, inside of squares. So you had the outer square and then a circle inside of that. That's not a reason, I guess. So I don't know how to answer what the reason is, just that that's the history. And people have continued to do it, and presumably it worked, or they wouldn't have continued to do it.
I'd just add that it is the same in the medieval Arabic tradition. It's often circles inscribed within squares, and the squares have gates on each of the four surfaces. And at least in the Arabic tradition as well, it's not only a protective device, it's a portal, which is often very much associated with the portals of, for example, a bowl or a goblet of liquid. So I think that because it has that relationship, at least in the tradition that I'm working in, of often young boys kind of scrying with bowls of liquid, that the circle makes a kind of ideal portal shape, mirroring, and often also like a black mirror. So there's this kind of round surface which serves as a portal in that imagery.
The circle inside the square is also part of the Jewish tradition. And with the Greek circles, you frequently have a path drawn into them, which is guarded by a knife or a sharp blade, because spirits don't like sharp blades pointed in an outwards direction.
Can I also ask an even more naive question to the three experts? Namely, why should a spirit be concerned with random lines drawn on the ground if they are not bound to physics, let's say, physical boundaries?
Can I answer that?
Bother whether there is a circle drawn on the ground or not? They can fly anywhere, or I don't know if fly is the right term. Why would they not cross this boundary? Is there some emic understanding of the theory of that in the texts or in the traditions that you study?
Well, I see a parallel with behavior in airports where unruly passengers will queue up but not cross the last yellow line until they're beckoned to come forward. And that is just odd. Why don't people just barge up to the counter as they might in China, rather than patiently waiting behind the line? And I think it's hard to say the psychology of spirits, but the way the spirits approach the lines on the floor is somewhat similar to that.
In the Arabic tradition, at least, it's very much related to the history of, well, it's often actually the word khat is used, which is the same word for penmanship. So you write the circle as an act of inscribing, and of course, it's not just lines; it's often verses of the Quran and other words of power, and it very much ties into a conception of the world as text and all of us as both writers and written aspects of the kind of world as Quran. So I think that the surface of the ground in that case is like a page, and the sword is like a pen.
Yes, with regards to the sword, it seems to be quite frequently that spirits avoid sharp metal, particularly iron blades, so that in Summa Sacra Magica there are actually 7 swords used in the 3rd book. And the circle should be traced out with either a dagger or with a sword, and the passing of the sharp metal blade through the air, I think, produces some kind of boundary that the spirits are aware of, and mostly won't cross.
And I suppose also to Bernd's point, I'm also wondering to what degree the circle also acts as a kind of index of authority with various divine names written into it, and often these circles are called seals. And it, as a calligrapher, it's impossible for me not to think of them as literally like having been pressed into the ground in the way that an aristocrat would seal a document, giving that document royal authority. And therefore, is there a sense in which these magical circles are also acting as indexes of authority, whereby spirits can and can't do things because of the presence of certain divine names or verses of the Quran or other kinds of uh,
Yeah,
representations of celestial authority?
yeah. Maybe I can add here on two things connecting like back to what have been said before about what is the power of just a line on the ground. And I have an interesting story from my architectural background where my professor once told me that once you trace a line on the paper, your hand should tremble because what you're doing, you're actually erecting a wall. And it's very interesting because precisely what has been said before, these lines are traced even with swords, right? So there's sort of an active signification of the gesture that confers some sort of a solidity to what is going on there. It's not just a line, a simple line that you're tracing, and about the connection with the seal, and the authority. Well, what is very clear from a comparative analysis of the different templates we have of magic circles is that in the Latinate tradition and Christian tradition is that there's a strong evidence that this comes from cosmographical templates. So there are geometries that describe the structures of the universe. They're usually concentric circumferences and directional axis, but that also incorporate other elements like precisely angelic and divine names, and names of power traced in usually in the inner band of the concentric circles. And so once the practitioner enter the circle and put themselves at the center of it, they're actually in a place of power. They are at the center of the universe, right? They are at the center of the locus communum, the universal place. Here we are dealing with an understanding of the cosmos in Aristotelian term, right? In the Middle Ages, they thought of the cosmos as in Aristotelian term, and Aristotle divided in the concept of place in two ways. So there is the place of the things of the create, of objects and animals and humankinds, which is the proper place, and then the place that surround everything, which is the outermost boundary of the universe. So by a sort of magic circle therefore becomes a sort of miniaturization of this universal place, and this is what probably Jonathan Smith, an historian of religion, would call it. So a miniaturization of a sacred space. And there's this interesting dynamic, not only in the history of magic, but also in other religious traditions of miniaturizing to increase the sense of power. This is also using talismanic magic, like you create portable objects you miniaturize certain cosmological dimension into portable objects, and there is a similar dynamic, spatial dynamic involved in creating a place of power and a place of authority with the magic circle, I would argue.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Emily.
Oh, I just wanted to say to Justin that at least in the text that I've been working on, the link that you're making between the seal and the circle is explicit. The ritual is often accompanied by creating such a seal and hanging it above the circle. And then, it's often culminated in a contract. So it is like a legalistic kind of relationship that you're entering into with the spirits. But I also completely agree with what Andrea is saying. I think the idea of the microcosm is also essential there.
I have a question for Stephen, following up on these rather theoretical remarks. How does that play out from your practical experience? Do you feel in the center of the universe? Do you feel that stepping into the circle increases your sense of power? And considering that there are many texts that work without circles, is there, from your perspective, a difference when you use a circle or when you don't use a circle? Do you feel more protected with a circle? Do you practice deliberately without a circle on some occasions? These were plenty of questions.
Okay, I see a circle as protection. I see the bit about universe, microcosm, macrocosm, but when actually using it, the circle is the limit to which I can move or gesticulate or anything else like that. And then from the position within the circle, the invocation or the evocation is drawing whatever you like to call them, spirits, entities, etc., to the circle. And you need a boundary because at least I don't want spirits and entities to accumulate next to me or on top of me. So you need a boundary. Now, the exception to that is working with angelic entities where you might use, as you say, something without a circle, because in theory they're not going to be harmful. But if you're working with spirits or demons, then I feel you need a protection. So I see it more as a protection rather than as a microcosm-macrocosm connection. I don't know whether that answers your question. But
Stephen, could I follow up on that?
Sorry?
Could I follow up on that and ask, in your experience as a practitioner, have you found the literature produces a huge amount of magical circles, and I was wondering, in your experience as a practitioner, have you found a specific magical circle or a style of magical circle to be more or less efficacious in providing you that sense of protection or providing that sense of protection?
Yes, but not in terms of what is actually written on the floor. My observation is that if the circle is simply roughly drawn, then the amount of protection offered is not nearly as great as having traced it round with a sharpened blade. That's the real difference. So I would always use a sharpened blade to redraw it before going ahead and evoking.
Do you draw it into the sand so that it's visible, or any other surface where you leave a mark?
Well, yes, I would normally work with a painted circle or a charcoal circle on a canvas spread or a cardboard spread. I'm not really an outdoors person, so the idea of tracing it in the dirt out in the open somewhere, I don't feel very comfortable with, but I'm sure there are a lot of practitioners who do. Yeah, and so I keep a selection of circles already pre-drawn to be laid out and then re-edged with a blade. And that's it as far as I'm concerned.
Indeed, it's very complicated things to trace it with a tip of a sword, a perfect circumference. Indeed, like often in the manuscript we find the specification that you find a even and plain soil without stones and other
Yes.
things you can that will prevent you to trace a very perfect circle. Yeah.
I think anybody who's just tried to trace a circle in the country or on a just recently leveled area will realize that it's not all that easy unless you only want a very approximate scratch in the ground. I did at one stage live in a place where there was a circle of trees. The center was just earth, and it was possible there to not quite dig a circle, but scrape it in the ground. But I feel more comfortable with the canvas circle, even if, and if it's outdoors, then I would take a canvas circle with me and lay it out. And yes, I do like properly drawn lines.
I would like to ask a question to Andrea. So you make connections between the design of a ritual space and cosmological assumption, and then you say that the placement of the practitioner at the center is connected to ritual efficacy, if I have understood you well. But is ritual efficacy also connected to a reconfiguration of the network of relations that the practitioner has with different spiritual entities and with God? And if yes, would you say that the magic described in the Solomonic tradition can also be interpreted as a technology of the self, in the sense that one experiences a sort of union with a divine principle when standing at the center of a circle?
Yes, very complex questions, and I'll try to answer in the most accessible way. But so I would start by saying that Solomonic magic, and I would prefer to use necromancy here, as like probably is necromancy that's better represented by the technique of magic circles. Doesn't necessarily use circle for placing the magician inside, but there could also be systems of two systems of circles. For example, the Liber Iurato Sonori, where we find the practitioner standing in one circle and the angels or demon summoned are in the other circles. And but also we can find, for example, practitioners outside and the superhuman being inside the circle. When it comes to I think that like in medieval ritual magic, authority and this like reconfiguration of networks, cosmological networks that grants power to the magician to summon a spiritual being doesn't come only from the circle, but actually it comes from the preparatory phases before stepping in the circle. The practitioner should be purified bodily and mentally and in the soul, so she become basically a perfect Christian, a pious Christian that will be granted permission from God to summon the spirit. So the magic circle is just another device, another step towards effective practice. When I talk about ritual efficacy, I mean perceived efficacy by, in this case, medieval practitioners, and the fact that what I call, and I want to return back to when the circle is used as a protective device, how I call them are imaginal architectural devices, in the sense that in the ritual operations, the way in which circles are constructed, the way in which material culture is manipulated to construct magic circle, have the ability to increase the sense of solidity of the boundary, of the circular boundary. And so the way in which practitioners manipulate not only the sword, but also the suffumigations and the other actions that are involved in the construction of the circle, have the ability to feel a sense of boundaries in the person that is inside the circle. And in that sense, I talk about the ritual efficacy of the circle, the ritual efficacy of sensing, in fact, a bidimensional line on the ground as a wall that will protect you from attacks from outside. However, like the transmissions, and the template of the circles differs greatly, and so also the way in which they work differs. For example, we have in the miscellany at the Munich Bavarian State Library. It has been edited by Richard Kickefer. I'm sure many of Esoterica listener knows about this handbook. We find circles used actually for transactions with spirits. So, for example, food and object is exchanged through the boundary of the circle. So the circle protect the body of the magicians or the operator, but actually allows for or filter a communication between the human and the superhuman world. So it also varies a lot depending on what experiments we are looking at, what handbook we are looking at. If we take, for example, the Key of Solomon, certainly, yes, magic circle offer great protection, but also the design of this circle in the Key of Solomon are very, very complex. I have here Dr. Skinner edition of the Key of Solomon. Here we can see how indeed complex and how indeed we can feel a sense of just looking at it, of protection from the amount of boundaries that the practitioner will be surrounded by. So yeah, I hope I answer the question. Yeah.
And that particular one also has a pathway to enter
Exactly.
and to be sealed and closed, which is quite practical.
Emily, I have a question when it comes to the transmission of all of this. It's so difficult for me to imagine a period before the magical circle. But if you look at texts like the PGM, or I think of the Sefer HaRazim, they don't really appear there in a very strong sense. They're not, they're not there strongly, like, and they don't really appear much in Jewish magic that much. They're not so central. That I do know of cases where even to this day circles are drawn around women who are giving birth to protect them from Lilith, and that's still, I have seen people do that. That is still a thing that goes on. Um, but and then you have famously the story of Choni Hamagail, the Choni the circle maker, who doesn't stand inside the boundary, the circle for protection. He stands inside of it as a protest. I'm not leaving the circle until I can force God to make it rain. And so it's maybe he is inside the circle to protect him from God, but it's a more of an act of protest. And I guess the question I'm curious, Emily and Dr. Skinner and Andrea, of course, is it's difficult to imagine a period of time before the magical circle, and yet it does develop. It has it's evolving, it's changing, it's mutating. And I'm curious, Emily, starting with you, when do you see the magical circle enter into Islamic magic? And then Dr. Skinner and Andrea, also, I'm curious about when this element enters into into magical history, because it does seem to do so at a discrete moment in history. As I said, it doesn't really seem to be a big deal in the PGM. It's not a really big deal in Jewish magic, despite the fact that so much of magical circles are dominated by Hebrew text, which has always struck me as curious. But
So, yeah, that's a great question. And in the Arabic text that I've been working on, actually, the word that they use for these circles is mandal, and it does point to quite an ancient Sanskrit Buddhist tradition of the mandala, which is not something that I'm expert on, but it's clear that the influences are coming from a sort of Indic direction there. And people have also pointed to things like the very old sort of Aramaic magic bowls and the way that those are used to contain spirits in a circular shape. As far as the origins of this in Islam, there are stories of the Prophet Muhammad going out to talk to the jinn and drawing protective circles on the sands of the desert for his friends while he does so. So that seems to be there from the beginning of Islam, though it's not called a mandal in the context of the hadith about the Prophet Muhammad. As far as its entry into the Latin West, I am very much convinced that that was in part a transmission from the Arabic development of those older Indic traditions. And the rituals that Andrea was describing for purification before entering the circles, and all the various specific steps with the knives and everything that we've talked about, really it is in the Arabic seemingly before it's in the Latin, and you kind of just need to substitute out all the verses of the Quran with verses of the Bible to arrive at roughly the same ritual. So that's my perception, but then again, I am relatively ignorant of the European tradition itself compared to you gentlemen. So take that for what it's worth.
And I think it's interesting, as you pointed out, that we've talked about how typically angels aren't summoned into circles, except for we have an entire tradition of summoning angels using a device called the Almandel, which is not a circle but a rectangle.
Well, there is a
Or a
circle to
square.
summon Metatron
Right.
in the book that I'm working on. But yeah, you're right. It is usually jinn and the so-called children of Satan in the works that I'm familiar with. But yeah, and that word is clearly related to the word that I'm talking about, the etymology of which is very complex, incidentally. Mandal, it doesn't just mean the mandala in the Buddhist tradition. It also appears to refer to a region of India that is famous for producing aloes wood, which is itself a substance that's very important to these rituals. And sometimes mandal means aloes wood. Incidentally, I'm getting all of this from the great Travis Ade at Yale University, who has done some really excellent work on this subject, if you want to know more about that.
From the Egyptian tradition, although the PGM doesn't have a specific mention of the circle, I think the Ouroboros, the serpent swallowing its own tail, is very much a part of the Egyptian structure, and possibly therefore isn't spoken about. But the other thing that is important, both in the Egyptian and right throughout the Middle Ages, was purity and consecration of the operator and the equipment before it's actually used. And there's quite a lot of that. So that's another form of protection as well, that the knives and the swords are consecrated beforehand.
I do absolutely agree with Emily. I also think that the this, inception of this ritual device, so in terms both of material culture and the rationale behind magic circle in summoning demons comes from the tradition of the mandala and the mandala and the tantric mandala absorbed through a contact with in the Islamic context. I've written about this in my dissertation as well, and we don't have sources, or we don't yet know sources that where we can trace a genealogical transmissions, but we also know that there are very clear influences between these traditions. For example, of course, Emily know very well Al-Sakaki text, and some part of that grimoire were translated into Latin. we start seeing in the Latinate context, we start seeing, yes, probably the earliest examples I have is from the 13th century. And about the mandal, what is interesting, I think that if we look at the al mandal in the Latinate context, we have two different traditions. One has an Arabic matrix, and usually the al mandal, the altar, the portable altar to summon planetary angels, is made of copper. And then we have the other more Christian Judeo-Christian traditions of the al mandal made out of wax. So when we look at the different instances in the manuscript of how to construct the al mandal in the Arabic tradition, so derived from Arabic text, we can see the al mandal can also be a circle or a square traced on the ground. So here we can definitely see how indeed intricate is the ritual dynamics of how techniques from the Islamic context happen to be acculturated into the Latinate one. And indeed, I do therefore think as well that yes, that's the connection. There is also another very interesting compendium that was written in the 16th century at the Bijapur court. It's called, in translation, the Stars of the Signs, and it's a Persian manuscript, and it contains a lot of examples of beautifully illustrated mandala. And also, when you look at the text and you read the instruction, you can really see like a strikingly compelling material culture similarity of elements that doesn't have an instrumental function, so to trace the circle, for example, and you find it exactly repeated also in the Latinate context. So I think more research should be done on the actual sources and how this tradition could have happened to be related, but definitely I see there as well a link.
I have a question for Stephen. So in the Key of Solomon, in this version that was then published by Mathers in the late 19th century, which is probably the most used version until today, there is this, let's say, it's a climatic development of the ritual. So you basically do the first round, and then it is written that the spirits should appear on the edge of the circle. If they don't, you do the next more powerful conjuration, and then the spirit should appear at the edge of the circle. And I think there are 3 or 4 rounds until you use the most powerful conjuration. And the whole idea is that you actually see, as Andrea has also mentioned, spirits in some corporal form arriving at the edge of the circle. So from your practitioner perspective, how does that play out in reality? Is the circle also a tool that helps to, well, get this impression? So you need the edge as an area of where the spirits manifest, so that you can perceive them with your senses, internal or external senses, or however you want to interpret it. And so this is maybe also a function of the circle. It's the point of contact, if you like, where you get an impression that something is actually happening. So how did you experience this in your
Okay. So yes, you can quite frequently see atmospheric disturbances outside the circle. So one of my colleagues described it once as if you have champagne bubbles in the air around the circle. Not necessarily figures and faces, but quite often things like that. And that is an indication, or is usually thought of as an indication, that the spirits have actually arrived. And at that point, you don't keep pushing them harder and harder, because as in the Key of Solomon, if you've done the first three, then you go around threatening them after that, which is not probably a very good idea. Let me tell you one story of an evocation that I did, which seems to point up some of the qualities of the circle and what can be seen. Some of you may have heard me talk this before, but we were doing an evocation in a castle, or at least it was a castle just outside of Bath. And we were evoking a demon whose qualities connected to birds. But I won't give you the name of the demon at this point. And we worked at it, and after a while, we could actually hear the twittering of birds. This, I have to point out, was about 1 a.m. in the morning, where you don't normally expect birds to be awake. But as we kept evoking, we got the impression that a swarm of birds had actually come down the chimney and into the room, and we could see them. And this is really, they were probably spirits, maybe they were real birds, we don't know. And they started to fly around the circle quite rapidly. And then we carried on and we finished the operation. And in the morning, I came in to clear up after the operation, which was actually successful in another context. And on the floor, which we had swept and cleaned very thoroughly beforehand, there was bird shit. And so we can assume that whatever it was brought physical birds into the room. But the thing that is most important for this conversation is that the bird shit was only outside of the circle. There was no bird shit inside the circle. So here, this for me was a convincing argument that the circle has a physical level of power or limitation. Now, you're all welcome to just assume that we were completely deluded, but I cannot, and I have photographed the floor, you can't get past the fact that real physical birds were drawn in at 1 o'clock in the morning and down a chimney and around the room and then finally out via the chimney as well. So that's just an anecdote, but I think that there's some elements in that which point up what the circle does, what the circle can do, and also what an evocation can do, that you actually can attract physical entities or physical things as well. That's it.
May I ask a question? Following up on Bert's question and that anecdote, please. I suspect you've all heard that in the Arabic tradition, there's the alam al-mathal or alam al-khayal, the realm of the phantom image, which is a very real place, but an imaginal place, like a liminal place that is typically invisible. And thinking of the in which the imagination serves, in the kind of Neoplatonic vocabulary, as a kind of screen on which the invisible can be projected in a visible form, not necessarily its true form, but something that we can at least interact with as on the screen. And I'm wondering if you see the circle in such a situation as not only a protective device, but, indeed like a kind of glass-walled portal to another dimension, where the physical and the imaginal are somehow in contact at the borders.
Well, yeah, it certainly could be a border between this world and the other world in which the spirits exist. I think there are a lot of stories about magical mirrors, which have the same sort of feel about them. You look in the mirror and you see something which is in another world rather than in this world. But
Thank you.
If I may have another add-on question, Stephen. So you mentioned bubbles or bubble-like impression at the edge of the circle. And then you mentioned birds' cries and then also physical impressions of birds. So I guess these are two examples of kind of verification experiences, or sensations that demonstrate to the practitioner that the ritual is somehow successful. And what other types of verifications would you say come up when you use a circle?
okay, there's a number of physical indications of success and evocation. We won't talk about angels at this point, but evocation. There will sometimes be a temperature drop. There will often be changes in the lighting in the room, and it's not necessary to do these operations at night, as I originally thought. It can happen during the day, and then even during the day, the light intensity will sometimes change. I don't know whether that answers your question.
This confirms also what we find in medieval grimoires, often like indeed the instruction says you should expect to feel like a change of temperature, to suddenly be sweating, or like other kind of haptic sensations.
Yeah, and if there isn't some fairly obvious physical change, then you begin to doubt that your evocation has actually worked. And of course, these things could be just impressions caused mentally, but I feel that they're really rather quite physical.
If I may have another question, no one is raising the voice, because you mentioned mental impressions, Stephen and Andrea. You mentioned the imagination previously. So this relates a bit to the development of all this into the 20th century. As you may know, I've worked on with and on Frater Acher, who is a quite well-known modern traditionalist practitioner who also practices a lot of grimoires, and I've studied his Arbatel cycle, and there he kind of displays a lot of speculations about what are the necessary ingredients of these rituals, what do you have to do physically, and what can you move into the mental or imaginative realm. So I guess this is a modern phenomenon. Imagination has played a role in pre-modern magic, but I think it really became a thing in the 20th century. And he argues somewhere that this whole physical enactment of the ritual with the circle, all the symbols, the swords and the ropes and so on, they are basically tools to enact a change within. And when you can make this change within, say in your imagination, then you don't need the physical tools anymore, but you can do most of the practice in your imagination. I think Aleister Crowley was also an important figure who has experimented with these dynamics. So I wonder, again, Stephen, from your practitioner perspective, what do you make of this? I understood that you're more traditionalist, but would you say that the imagination can take the same function as these physical performances?
No, I don't think that imagination actually has a use in magic, despite what a lot of people will say. When I've done various operations experimentally with, say, three other operants, we would make a rule that nobody would speak after the ritual. We would all go and sit down somewhere and write the description of what we saw and what we heard, because I wanted to know, did everybody see the same thing? And no, not everybody sees the same thing, but they see similar things. You know, the one practitioner will see the light changes, but not the champagne bubbles in the air. Another one will see the champagne bubbles, but not the light changes. But the timing will be the same. You know, after this particular part of the ritual, then the atmosphere changed. And I've done a number of these experiments trying to calculate exactly, and really it comes down to the more sensitive practitioners see more of the effects. But in a good ritual, everybody has seen some effect or other at roughly the same point. I don't think, does that answer your question, or does it just generate some more questions?
I have something of a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So this is where my background in philosophy kicks in, and one of the questions I have for Stephen and Emily and also Andrea is that Thomas Aquinas, and on his book on spiritual creatures, which is, I think, one of the most important books written in the Middle Ages about spiritual creatures, which doesn't get a lot of study, but Thomas makes the argument that spirits can't be seen by the eyes because they're not physical things. Rather, spirits make impressions directly upon the fantasia of the person. And therefore, when you see them, when you're not seeing them with your eyes, they're directly impressing upon the fantasia. And that's contraindicated, Dr. Skinner, um, with your comment about the bird poop, right? Like they left behind, unless they're still poking around, pressing upon the fantasia of the bird poop around, which I suppose is possible. But I guess what I'm wondering is, um, and I'm asking from a practical point of view from Dr. Skinner what you think, but also from a historical point of view in terms of how these ideas develop, Emily in the Islamic context and also Andrea in the medieval context, of how these entities are impacting. And Stephen, I'm wondering, do you buy Thomas's um, story for the mechanism, or do you think that it is a different mechanism by which these entities appear? Like when you're seeing the bubbles, are they impressing those images and onto the imagination or the fantasia, or are there actual bubbles there?
Well, I don't think I know the answer to that. I know that I will see the bubbles, whether it's coming via my fantasia or it's coming because of some physical change in the air, it's very hard to tell, because there you are. Where's this information coming from? I mean,
This
even
is
with
to
the
your
birds,
question, your point earlier about the people seeing different things in the same
same
ritual.
time.
I think
Yeah,
Thomas would say, yeah, that's because
yeah, you might have a very good point there. And with the birds and the physical poo, the spirits may have just encouraged birds to come into the room, just as Jesus encouraged spirits to enter pigs, who then raced down the hill and drowned themselves. So there's definitely some possibility of affecting physical animals or even other humans. But as to the actual root of these impressions, I have no idea. I just know that I've seen it, and that other practitioners have seen it at the same time. Normally, a subset of the whole range of visual effects. But some people see more and some people see less. But that's just a matter of, maybe it's a matter of their different fantasia. I don't know.
And Andrea, you mentioned CLM 849. There's a great story in there where the practitioner summons a banquet, and not everyone's seeing the banquet. And this is an interesting question about the phenomenology of magic. It's fascinating to me, is that we assume uh, a shared phenomenological space, but magic seems to be highly disruptive of that.
Yeah.
Can I pipe up here? I'm
Please.
bursting too, because I've been working on this so much recently. In the Arabic, the power of the jinn really seems to rest on basically tahyil, which is the projecting of phantom images into the imagination, and it's also used of poets. Poets also have this power to create images in your head. And I mean, I think very much draw, and it's not clear that jinn have power beyond that. There's a debate about that. And it seems to be very much drawing from these older philosophical debates, such as in Synesius on dreams, about the role of the imagination in both deceiving and in guiding to the truth. And he says that everybody's imagination is very much kind of distorted, like a funhouse mirror, by your own personal experiences, which will affect the way that you see everything, including the world, including the real birds flying around and booing, and so the line between matter and mind, as we all know, is still very much a subject for debate. And this is precisely like where the hard problem of consciousness raises its head in the philosophy of magic.
I can step in here. Yes, regarding your questions. So there are two questions here, right? So to say, the imaginal turn how to ritual space in the history of learned magic, what Bernd referred to, and just in your questions about the contradiction or frictions between spiritual beings and the medieval theological debate, and actually what is going on in conjuring spirits. Well, when it comes to Thomas of Aquinas, and of course theological speculation about what is the place of angels, and therefore what is the place of fallen angels? Do they have a body? Do they not have a body? Theologians, there was a lot of discussions. Let's say that the mainstream argument was that they actually don't have a place and don't have a body, but they take on or assumed they can take shapes. They can take shape of, for example, of compacted air, but that's not actually their bodies, or they can be in place virtually. And therefore then it comes the question, so why is pointless, right, for a practitioners of medieval magic to try to attract from a location a spirit which the spirit doesn't have locations? But we should not forget that the the cosmology, angeliology, and demonology of learned magic are not orthodox, right? They are not. They don't necessarily buy these visions of angels and spirit. It actually comes from other traditions, from Arabic and traditions of magic, where the cosmology is way, or the images that of these entities are way more corporeal, and they actually manifest in way more sensorial way on what were portrayed in the theological debate in the Latin context. So here we are in an entangled history, right, of cosmology and angeliology that then manifests also in the way of how to practice magic. And then the imaginal turn. So in the Middle Ages, in learned magic, when it comes to constructing circles, there's not so much about the imagination or imagining that is a wall or that is a impenetrable boundaries. The focus is really on the action that it's doing. When we come to the 20th century, and I think that the reason is deeply entangled with the Golden Dawn practices, and what it comes especially with the notion of the astral plane and techniques of visualization, that we start to see practitioners engaging with meditative and visualization techniques to work in the astral plane, and so to create replicas of temples. For example, the temple of the Abramelin. Here, there's no magic circle, but an entire villa that could be, reproduced in the mental space, in the imaginal space of the astral plane, and one could perform the ritual very privately and secretly, even riding on a through the desert as Crowley did. But it's very interesting about the circle. Instead, it's very interesting what happened with Wicca instead. Right, we know that for Wicca comes from the rituals of Wicca come from this, ceremonial magic traditions, and the circle, of course, is a paramount device, and depending on what tradition, of course, but usually Wiccans trace the circle by visualizing, so that you should visualize the energy flowing from your arm towards the point of the ritual knife, and then should be traced, right? And you should actually, with the power of imagination, with the active imagination, visualize the circle. So here we are in completely different dimensions, right, of what actually medieval practitioner did, and I think that this process has to do with what happened in the late 19th and early 20th century with initiatory magical order as the Golden Dawn.
That said, I do think in the medieval tradition there's an imperative to hone your focus or your intention, isn't it? Maybe not necessarily visualize what you're saying, but somehow.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
There is this series of novels around the figure of Bartimaeus, who is a powerful jinn, and the whole book series is described from his perspective, what happens when he's conjured or summoned and so on. And it's a very interesting story. And his point is that you, as a jinn or as a spirit, you always wait for the circle to have a gap. Otherwise, you can't do anything. You can't resist against the summoning. You have to basically do what the magician asks you to do when he uses the correct formula. But a gap in the circle is the only option you have as a spirit to change the game, because then you can enter the circle and possess the magician or even kill it. So it has quite devastating implications. And I've actually encountered this idea in an early modern grimoire in the Leipzig collection. So there I actually found a warning what can happen when you're sloppy in drawing the circle, because the spirits, they can be really dangerous then. And yeah, I wonder, Stephen, if you've encountered events with badly drawn circles, and whether you would subscribe of this idea of Bartholomeus, that the drawing of the circle is really key.
Well, I would certainly agree that the drawing of the circle is important. This is one of the reasons why drawing circles on the earth outside is not very effective, because there's bound to be breaks. It reminds me of a story that Aleister Crowley once told, and I don't hold Crowley up as an important figure, but he talks about an evocation where somebody, never mind who, threw sand over the circle until it actually broke, and then after that, the demon, being called, could take action against the person in the circle. But anyway, that's anecdotal. I have to say that all my circles are very thoroughly painted, so I haven't experimented with a broken circle, so I can't tell you what happened, sadly. Or perhaps just as well. So who wrote the Bartimaeus books?
I forgot the name, but he did a lot of research. I was quite impressed by. I mean, it's a fantasy story.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of correct magical theory behind it.
Well, yeah, it sounds quite interesting.
Yeah.
Well, folks, I think we've come to time, but I guess two things I want to do is one, I'd love to invite all of you back onto Esoterica in the future. There's so much more depth of conversation here, so much more to learn from Emily about Islamic magic, and Stephen from the practical, and Andrea also so much on your work. So I'd love to have all of you back on for further deeper conversations. But as I mentioned in the beginning, this was a conversation that's part Esoterica and part RINSEP, which again is this fascinating, wonderful, important business of putting academics, scholars, and practitioners into conversation, in the hopes, and I think the realization that we can all learn and be better for it. I love the insights that I get from my practitioner folks, and I hope that the practitioners will deal with us insufferable academics. And so I really appreciate that. So again, check out RINSEP. You can see the links in the description. But yeah, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out today to come talk about magic circles, and providing perspectives from, again, the purely scholarly and academic to the actual doing of the thing. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to contribute in the ways that you did.